Well, it's very nice to be here. I've never been in this building. Incredible space to be with you in. So I have from now until 1 o'clock about to try to talk about all of this. So I have a couple of things in mind. I'm gonna give you a little background about myself and about my history with Buddhism. I'm gonna read you some prepared material, some material from other people who have inspired me. We'll have time for some questions, and I'd also like to do a brief experiential kind of meditation with those of you who are interested in that kind of thing. And we'll take a break about halfway through, so I think there's time for everything. I think one of the reasons why you asked me to come today to talk specifically about the mindful approach to anxious times, and I think we are in anxious times, there's some very good reasons for it, is that I had the strange and I think fortunate experience of coming to Buddhism, learning about Buddhism, encountering Buddhism, immersing myself in Buddhist psychology, Buddhist thought, Buddhist practice, really before I knew very much about anything else. I was in my early 20s, maybe not even quite 20, when in a freshman world religion class that I wasn't even planning on taking. I only took because I met a girl in my first week of college who was taking this class, and it had never occurred to me, but I thought, oh, well, you know, if she's taking it, I'm going to take it too. And the first semester was Eastern religion, and the second semester was Western religion, and in the first semester, the Eastern religion part, some of it was Hinduism, and some of it was Buddhism, and some of it was Taoism. And we read, in the Buddhist section, we read a collection of Buddhist verse called the Dhammapada, which is a collection of poems, really, Buddhist poems, that were meant not for monks and nuns, not really for educated people, but for lay people, for householders. And it was a very good translation done by a visiting scholar from Calcutta, who I think was at Hofstra and did this translation, but somehow we were using it in this class. And there was one chapter that was just called Mind that jumped out at me, that was like the first Buddhist thing that made a deep impression on me. And in a minute I have it here, I'll read it to you. But that kind of set me on my way, and it turned out at Harvard in those years there were a number of younger people, graduate students mostly, who were also interested in Buddhism. So it was kind of in the air a little bit in Cambridge in the early 70s. And the next year I took a class, like a mind-body psychophysiology class. It was the very beginning of what's now become cognitive neuroscience. And the teaching fellow in that class was a graduate student named Daniel Goleman, who went on to become the psychology writer for the New York Times, and then wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence that many of you probably know, judging by the response already. But he had been in India already, studying Hindu and Buddhist forms of meditation. He was very interested in meditation. And I didn't know any of that, but all I knew when I went into his classroom, he was the graduate student, so it was a small class, was he was wearing these purple bell-bottom pants that telegraphed something special. So I knew he had something that I wanted. And I made friends with him and found out he'd been in India, and told him how I'd taken this other course, and I was interested in, in meditation maybe, although I didn't know that much about it. And he said, oh, if you're interested in this stuff, you should go out to Boulder this summer, or next summer, The summer of 1974, there was an institute, a summer camp, really, that was just starting called Naropa. That was like a Buddhist summer camp, the summer of 1974. So I dutifully went out there, and there I was exposed to Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein, who were they'd both been in the Peace Corps in the 60s and were just back to America. They didn't know each other then. And they were just starting to teach, and they were teaching Vipassana meditation, mindfulness meditation, in a way that they're still teaching now, 45 years later. But that was the very beginning. And Naropa then was also, it was all the Buddhist world, all the Americans who'd been interested in Buddhism. And it was also a lot of New York culture. So there were dancers from Judson Church and poets from St. Mark's Church. And, and I was still coming from Boston. I hadn't moved to New York yet. So it was like a huge onslaught of both spiritual and cultural information, all given to me all at one moment. So I became very attached to Joseph and Jack, Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfield, and they started teaching intensive meditation retreats around the country. They hadn't yet formed their retreat centers now are in Massachusetts, the Insight Meditation Society, and in California, in Marin, Spirit Rock. But they hadn't formed those yet. They were just renting sort of decrepit seminaries wherever they could find them. And leading these courses. And I was still in college, so I had a lot of, I could basically do what I wanted. So I took a number of these intensive, silent 2-week retreats with them, and then wrote my senior thesis at Harvard on Buddhist psychology, and then took a couple of years off and traveled with them through Asia, through Southeast Asia, meeting the teachers that they had studied with in Asia. Went to India, went to Burma, went to Thailand, went to Sri Lanka, went up to Dharamsala where the Dalai Lama was, and somewhere in there decided that I would, when I came back, go to medical school with the idea of becoming a psychiatrist. I had to take all the pre-med courses that I hadn't taken because until that time I was like, I'm never going to medical school, but it made sense at that point for me after discovering what was so interesting about Buddhism. I had the sense already that maybe I could somehow bring these two worlds together. So I was one of only 2 people in my entering medical school class who went there specifically to be a psychiatrist. So I sort of had the field to myself. But because I had been so involved in Buddhism already, I had very good training. Once I got out of medical school, I had very good training. I did my residency here at Westchester under Otto Kernberg, trained by a lot of psychoanalysts and so on. But I looked at everything, I think, pretty much through this Buddhist lens, which had really influenced me so strongly in my 20s. So a lot of the writing that I've done, which I've done pretty much on the side, mostly I have a therapy practice, and 4 days a week I see patients, but 1 day a week for the past however many years I've devoted to writing, and all the books that you heard about at the beginning have come out of that 1 day a week. But I've tried, I think I've seen what I'm doing as a kind of translation of Buddhist thought, of Buddhist psychology, into the Western psychodynamic language that I think is the language of the mind that most of us in our culture, even if we don't think of ourselves as Freudian psychoanalysts or whatever, the language of the mind that's kind of colonized the way we think is very suitable for trying to talk about the ancient Buddhist ways of thinking. So I've tried through the writing and also through my clinical work where I've tried to allow whatever it is that I've learned from Buddhist thought to filter into how I work as a therapist without deliberately, preaching to my patients. So some of that is what I want to try to talk to you about today, how the Buddhist way of thinking makes sense to me in light of later immersion in psychodynamic thought, if that makes sense. So that first verse from the Dhammapada that struck me, it's just called Mind. It goes like this. Like an archer, an arrow, the wise man steadies his trembling mind, a fickle and restless weapon. Flapping like a fish thrown on dry ground, it trembles all day, struggling to escape from the snares of Mara the tempter. So these first images, these are the ones I related to. Flapping like a fish thrown on dry ground, trembling all day, struggling to escape from the snares of Mara. Mara is an interesting character in the Buddhist world. Sometimes Mara is the devil, sometimes Mara is like a tempting god, sometimes Mara is really a stand-in for the ego. Because even after the Buddha is enlightened, according to the stories, Mara doesn't disappear. Mara is still whispering in the Buddha's ear, even post-enlightenment, saying, come on, you're wasting your time with this stuff. You could be a great ruler. You could have whatever you want. No one understands you. So the Buddha doesn't get rid of his ego. He doesn't get rid of Mara. He just changes his relationship to him, Mara the tempter. The mind is restless, to control it is good. A disciplined mind is the road to nirvana. Look to your mind, wise man, look to it well. It is subtle, invisible, treacherous. A disciplined mind is the road to nirvana. These adjectives I always really liked also. Subtle, invisible, treacherous. Then it goes on. Swift, single, nebulous. It sits in the cave of the heart. Who conquers it frees himself from slavery. No point calling him wise, whose mind is unsteady, who is not serene, who does not know the Dharma. The Dharma is a untranslatable word for the Buddha's teachings. It means the law or the truth. Comes from the root is from the word that's used for a throne. So it's the seat upon which the Buddha sat, kind of. Call him wise, whose mind is calm, whose senses are controlled, who is undisturbed by good and evil, who is wakeful. He knows the body for what it is, a frail jar. He makes his mind firm like a fortress. He attacks Mara with the weapon of wisdom. He guards what he conquers jealously. It is not long before the body, bereft of breath and feeling, lies on the ground, poor thing, like a burnt-out cinder. No hate can hurt, no foe can harm, as hurts and harms a mind ill-disciplined. Neither father, mother, nor relative, and I always add therapist, can help, as helps a mind that is well-disciplined. So this first idea, a mind well-disciplined, the trembling mind, flapping on the ground like a fish. But that can be disciplined. What does it mean to discipline the mind? That's what meditation is about. You can overdo it, this idea that the mind is bad and that we have to discipline it and that you have to bring it, too forcefully. That never works. Then the mind just rears up and attacks you back. But the idea that there's a gentler way, which is the middle way that the Buddha found for himself to bring the mind under some kind of control and to release its underlying potential. That is the antidote to anxiety, is the helpful thing in anxious times, which, we're in especially anxious times, but times are always anxious. That's going back 2,500 years, there were anxious times. So that element was the first energy that came to me, that gave me some kind of hope. Later, much later, through medical school, into my psychiatry training, into really an interest in and immersion in some aspects of psychoanalytic, psychodynamic thought, I came to see that there's a current in psychoanalytic thought that runs parallel to this Buddhist vision. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with, there's a psychoanalyst in New York named Michael Eigen, who's written a slew of books. He's written about one book a year for the past 25 years. But he has one called The Psychoanalytic Mystic, which for those of you who are interested in this overlap of the spiritual and the psychodynamic, if you don't know that book, it's really worth looking at. He takes on Lacan and Winnicott and Bion, Marion Milner, and talks about these kinds of parallels that I'm also interested in. And there's a little piece from his book that I think has the something similar to the piece from the Dhammapada, where he's talking about a British psychoanalyst named W.R. Bion. Bion is who I took Thoughts Without a Thinker, the title of my first book. That's a phrase from Bion. So Bion is a kind of mystical psychoanalyst in his own way. He was born in India, actually, but worked in London, and he was Samuel Beckett's analyst when Beckett was a young man. So it's not clear who influenced who in that relationship. But so this is from Eigen's book, talking about Bion, but I think you'll see the larger point. I think Bion, he says, is trying to describe the worst in us. And I think he is trying to do something more. I feel he is saying we must and can survive the worst if we are to be truly compassionate with ourselves and with each other, if we are going to be partners with the capacities that constitute us. That's a phrase that's become very important to me, partners with the capacities that constitute us. I think mindfulness is one of those capacities that we can learn to partner with. One of the great experiences in reading Bion, I think, is that over and over we come through the worst. We survive ourselves, build up tolerance for ourselves, make room for ourselves. In the face of the worst that he can experience or envision experiencing, including total destruction of experience, Bion maintained that a faith, that openness to the unknowable ultimate reality of a session, of a moment, of a lifetime, is somehow linked with growth processes. I think that Bion must have been close to destroying every possibility of goodness in life, and that he speaks from his own experience of surviving the great destruction. I think he must have discovered for himself that life erupts in the valley of the shadow of death. I think Bion always had an eye on the backcloth of destruction. He always was facing the horror of himself. A faith that, in spite of all horrors, experience is worthwhile is different from use of faith to avoid experiencing. That's sort of the key phrase for me in this that I think relates. I'll read it to you one more time. A faith that, in spite of all horrors, experience is worthwhile is different from use of faith to avoid experiencing. Because I think one of the big contributions of psychodynamic thinking is that we're willing to look at the dark side of things. We're willing to look at the horror. A lot of people drawn to the spiritual world, including the Buddhist world, sometimes don't really want to look at the horror of themselves. They're training their mind. They think they're disciplining their mind. They're training their mind actually to flick away the disturbing elements so that they can go to the peaceful, quiet, imagined, transcendent thing that they think is spiritual. I don't think that's truly the Buddhist approach, but it's often a sidetrack that people go off on. So I think this kind of thing, some people use faith to avoid experience, some people use faith to open to what otherwise is difficult to be open to. And that's what Bion is saying. The faith Bion fought for, says Eigen in this passage, was linked to intensity of living and risk of openness. Winnicott and Bion both share a conviction that an originary, naked self is the true subject of experience. Internalization processes are necessary for a fully developed human self, but something originary shines through. I think, says Eigen, that these authors would like the Zen koan, what was your original face before you were born? They all point to and grow out of moments of real living in which fresh possibilities of experience uplift the self. So in addressing today's topic, mindful therapy in anxious times, I want to talk about the contributions that Buddhist thought and practice can make in helping us manage and decrease anxiety. This notion, touched on by Michael Eigen, of an original naked self as the true subject of experience, of your original face before you were born, is central to what I want to try to say. How can we respond to these difficult times without becoming overwhelmed or cynically detached? How do we as therapists help others remain calm when in the privacy of our own thoughts we share their worries? Mindfulness meditation, rooted as it is in Buddhist psychology, has something important to offer in this regard. Its approach dovetails very nicely with contemporary psychodynamically inspired treatments for trauma, while at the same time offering a practical technique that can be of benefit to therapists and patients alike. Nonetheless, there's a fair amount of confusion in the field about how to integrate meditation into clinical practice. Let me give you a bit of my own history as an example. I first tried to meditate during the summer of 1973. It was after that first world religion class. It was the next summer, between my sophomore and junior years of college, when I was working for a cardiologist at the Boston City Hospital. This physician, Dr. Herbert Benson, was the first to publish a scientific paper about the relaxation benefits of transcendental meditation, made popular by the Beatles several years earlier. His co-author was a student of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the Indian guru who popularized TM, and together Benson and Wallace were among the first to show that meditation had measurable physiological effects. According to their studies, meditation slowed the body's metabolic rate, inducing what they called a wakeful hypometabolic state. They christened this effect the relaxation response, and suggested that its regular elicitation might actually lower blood pressure as well as relieve stress. Meditation was given scientific credence by their research. It was a real thing, not just someone's wishful thinking, and it had the potential to become an important tool of modern medicine. I was intrigued by this work and met with Dr. Benson at the behest of my father. I think it was an effort on my father's part to keep me in the medical fold, despite my burgeoning interest in what he considered a rather esoteric pursuit. My father was a physician, first at Yale and then at Harvard, and he was the chairman of the Department of Medicine that Dr. Benson was working in at the time. I had become intrigued with Buddhism in my first years of college, as I mentioned, but meditation was not yet something I had tried for myself. That Dr. Benson's influences were Hindu and not Buddhist meant little to me at the time. Since publishing his research on meditation, Dr. Benson had broken away from the Maharishi. He concluded that there was nothing special in transcendental meditation's approach, that a generic form of meditation could work just as well as the expensive training offered by the guru, and that it was his calling to bring meditation to modern medicine. Dr. Benson decided that the secret Sanskrit mantra at the heart of TM's trademarked approach was not essential, and that the simple act of alertly concentrating the mind, using whatever word, phrase, or prayer a person chose, could evoke an identical physiological response. For the patients in his hypertension clinic, he used the blandest word he could think of, the word one. Only later did he realize all of its potentially sacred meanings. Needless to say, his appropriation of TM's technique earned him the enmity of the guru and his followers. At the same time, despite the widespread media attention given to his research, his mainstream academic colleagues, my father included, treated him as a rather marginal figure. They pressed him on the quality of his research and upbraided him for drawing sensational conclusions from preliminary findings. As a result, despite his growing fame, Dr. Benson was a rather isolated figure when I met him. He felt misunderstood and inappropriately judged by both his medical and his meditative peers. None of this concerned me, however. I was happy to have a prestigious summer job with someone who was open to my abstruse interests. I knew that Dr. Benson was doing my father a favor by taking me on, but I surprised him in our first meeting by talking at length about the placebo effect, a subject I had explored during the previous semester at school. Placebos have been confounding modern medicine for generations. Pills that have no active ingredients, given as part of a routine doctor-patient interaction, regularly produce meaningful and scientifically documented improvement in a variety of illnesses, more than 1/3 of the time. Having grown up in a family in which academic medicine was king, and with a budding interest in the mind's pervasive influence on the body, I was taken with the placebo effect and thought Dr. Benson might be also. He was. He put me to work in the medical library, exploring and reviewing 50 years of relevant clinical research. Was there something that could be cultivated in the doctor-patient relationship that might be important for healing? Did the physician's concern for the patient or the patient's faith in the doctor make a difference in a patient's recovery? Might a placebo be somehow eliciting the relaxation response? Or was the relaxation response itself a manifestation of the placebo effect? Whichever way we looked at it, was there a key here to unlocking the body's ability to heal itself? Meditation was not a big part of my summer experience. I wondered about it, though. I remember sitting one sweltering August afternoon at my paper-strewn desk and finally trying out the technique. One, I repeated as my breath went in and out of my nostrils. One. Nothing in particular seemed to happen. It felt like a radical thing to interrupt my work, to sit there with my eyes closed, but at the same time, the exercise seemed empty to me. I liked the idea in principle. The possibility of quieting my body's tensions with a trick of the mind appealed mightily to me, but I did not feel engaged by the technique. I tried it a few more times and then put it back on the shelf. Even if there was such a thing as the relaxation response, and even if I could be sure I was eliciting it, the whole approach felt too mechanical to me. Somewhere in me, I knew that the relaxed state Dr. Benson envisioned could not be the be-all and end-all of what meditation was about. In thinking about it now, I can see how my research into the placebo effect helped explain why this clinical approach to meditation did not work for me. Science was of several minds about the placebo effect. Some researchers wanted to get rid of it altogether, since it was impossible to know if a new drug had anything to offer if it was no better than a placebo. Others wanted to tease out its active ingredient. What molecules, what neural pathways were being stimulated by something as innocuous as a sugar pill? Yet others saw the placebo effect as inextricably bound up with the doctor-patient relationship, not as something that could be isolated from it. Something mysterious happens when we turn our illness over to a caring physician, they concluded. Could the very act of trusting someone stimulate healing? Is there something in the human touch or in the caring human interaction or in human kindness that has beneficial medical results? In the article that I wrote with Dr. Benson that summer, we came down on the latter side. The placebo effect, whatever it derived from, is a neglected asset in the care of patients, we concluded. Modern medicine could benefit from taking it seriously. The placebo effect points to the body's capacity to heal itself, helped along by some combination of trust, faith, and human kindness. Meditation, at its best, endeavors to do something similar for the mind. It tries to create favorable conditions within the psyche so that the mind can realize its own potential. In drawing this parallel, I wish to refer back to the psychodynamic material I began with. Bion said that a faith that, despite all horrors, experience is worthwhile is different from use of faith to avoid experiencing. While meditation can be used to avoid experiencing, to shut oneself down or close oneself off, as can happen when one flicks away painful emotions instead of allowing them to ebb and flow through body and mind, it can also be used to make room for disagreeable experience. This is what lies at the heart of mindfulness, in which whatever arises becomes an object of meditation in itself. Obstacles are repositioned as opportunities, and the mind's ability to hold itself is supported. Mindfulness is different from relaxation. With mindfulness, we survive ourselves, build up tolerance for ourselves, and make room for ourselves. Rather than clinging to what is pleasant and pushing away what is unpleasant, we cultivate the ability to relate compassionately to what Jon Kabat-Zinn, the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction, has called the full catastrophe of our lives. Becoming partners with the capacities that constitute us, we promote growth processes that allow the mind to heal. This is the great promise of the Buddha anyway, one that is as relevant in psychotherapy as it is in meditation. Look to your mind, wise man, look to it well. A disciplined mind is the road to nirvana. A spiritual mentor of mine, upon hearing that I had become a quote-unquote Buddhist psychiatrist, put it this way: "Do you see your patients as already free?" he asked me. His question hit the nail on the head. From the Buddhist perspective, the mind's true nature is a given, your original face before you were born. Our individual histories and the horrors they contain keep us estranged, but the possibility is always there of our inherent freedom to poke through. Despite all of this, I really never saw myself as an expert in dealing with trauma until maybe 14 years ago or so. And this is really the inspiration for the book that I ended up writing about trauma. A young woman came to see me in my office, she was a professor of economics at a university in London, who had been vacationing in Sri Lanka with her husband and her parents and her two young children, or two young boys. And they were staying in an eco-resort on the coast of Sri Lanka in 2004 when the tsunami hit. And everyone in her family was caught in the wave, and everyone died but her. Her children, her parents, her husband, and she only survived. She was swept up in the water and washed ashore, and reached up when she surfaced and grabbed hold of a limb of a tree and held on. So she was the only one who survived. A wonderful, smart, beautiful woman. Completely devastated. And somehow, a year later, she ended up in my office in the basement of our building in Tribeca. And I was supposed to be her therapist. She had met the daughter of a woman whose husband had died in the World Trade Center, and I had treated the woman whose husband had died. And the daughter met this patient on an airplane and said, "You should come see this guy. He helped my mom." So she ended up with me, and I was like, oh no, like what am I going to do? But my first thought when she came to see me was, oh, she has two children and I have two children, and sitting here in my office, her children could be alive or dead. It's of no, there's no way to know really. So I started to ask her about her children, and she hadn't really been. It was too scary to talk about it before. People were she had wonderful friends who had helped her, who had gotten her this far, but to actually talk about the day-to-day reality of what her life had been that was so irrevocably, cut down in an instant, it had been too difficult. So slowly over time, I just got her to tell me everything, coming from that place of her experience, no matter how traumatic it was and how, hopefully it would never happen to anyone else that I knew, still it wasn't beyond the bounds of what all of us at one time or another were going to have to face. That's one of the Buddha's great truths, that we're all subject to separation from those we love at some point, his second noble truth of suffering is, there's suffering and separation from the loved. There's suffering in being, having to spend too much time with people that you don't love. There's suffering from old age, illness, and death, and so on. So this idea that somehow her trauma was outside of my experience, was one that over time, through these kinds of conversations, I came to realize, it wasn't very hard to relate to at all. And somehow that shared experience allowed her to process and digest and make sense out of who she was now and what had happened to her. And she wrote a beautiful book that's called Wave, if any of you are interested, where she does acknowledge the help of the therapy. So I think it's okay to be mentioning it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma now, with that as an introduction. You all following me okay? Yeah, okay. Trauma has long been thought of as something that happens only in extreme circumstances and mostly to other people. We're sensitive to it, but we tend to keep it at arm's length, if we can. Therapists diagnose it when certain critical conditions occur. A person must witness one or more events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of self or others. In addition, their response must involve intense fear, helplessness, or horror. Those close to the World Trade Center attacks, or the London subway bombings, or the nightclub destruction in Paris or Miami obviously qualify. Battlefield veterans and the journalists who cover them also do. Those who are caught up in sudden natural events, like my patient, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, experience trauma, as do people in motor vehicle accidents. A friend of mine was on an airplane about 35 years ago or so, coming to a party in Boston that ran off the Boston runway into the harbor upon landing. She was on a short flight from New York, and it was foggy and cold. 2 people were killed when the plane skidded off the icy runway, fell off the seawall, and broke in 2. For several days thereafter, my friend, who made it to the party, was convinced in an eerily detached way that her body was going to explode. I was doing my medical internship at the time, and I called a supervisor and brought her to the emergency room of the Massachusetts General Hospital. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress, which was a new concept then. She had been caught in an event that had threatened her physical well-being, and while she was outwardly calm, her underlying emotional state was one of intense fear and helplessness. With one part of her mind, she knew she was reacting to the accident and was in fact no longer at risk, but with another part of her mind, she was ready to erupt. The trauma, having created a split, reverberated within. There's another kind of trauma that also reverberates. And in talking about this, I'm heavily indebted to the work of Winnicott, who most of you would be familiar with, I hope. Children, especially young children, have all kinds of intense emotions, like fear, helplessness, and horror, before they have the language to describe or process them. Emotions develop before thought. Young children lack the capacity to understand what they are feeling. They're operating at an instinctual level, not on an adult one. But they have a need, the same need, for their feelings to be understood, even if they are incapable of understanding them themselves. Young children are completely dependent on their parents or caregivers for this. Like my friend on the airplane, they're constantly in danger of slipping out of control. Many parents intuitively sense their children's vulnerabilities and help them in all kinds of ways. They notice the feelings, put them into perspective, let their children know they are there, and put language on the experience. In myriad ways, they work to make their children's experience more tolerable. But when there's too much failure in this system, the emotions of childhood can be overwhelming and unbearable. Just imagine the feelings of a year-old baby left alone past the point of self-soothing. There's trauma inherent in such a scenario, and it often lives on. The primitive agonies of childhood, that's a phrase that Winnicott used a lot, primitive agony. The primitive agonies of childhood survive into adulthood and can make us behave as irrationally as my friend after the plane crash. In a wonderful book called Trauma and Human Existence, Robert Stolorow, psychoanalyst, writes of a woman named Anna who grew up in Budapest during World War II. She described a nameless terror that was revived in her analysis, where she remembered the horrors of the war years, and especially her father's incarceration and death. Her mother consistently denied the frightening realities of the war and of her father's death, never openly grieving. Anna perceived that her own terror and grief were unwelcome to her mother, and that she must not feel or name her emotional pain. So her most unbearable emotional states remained outside the horizons of symbolized experience. That's a good phrase. Nameless, until they found a hospitable home with her analyst, within which they could be named. This scenario is not limited to early childhood or to survivors of the Holocaust. As Stolorow wrote of his own personal trauma after the death of his wife, so long as my traumatized states found no welcoming relational home within which they could be given voice, they remained largely vegetative in nature. So this idea, this phrase, which comes from Stolorow of a relational home, is also central to what I'm trying to talk about today, because I think in meditation done in a particular way, and in psychotherapy done in a particular way, that's being fostered, this sense of a relational home in which difficult emotions, difficult experiences can be held, named, and digested. While most parents work hard to protect their children from the inherent instability of life, it's impossible to completely avoid it. Even if we make it through childhood and adolescence in one piece, even if we're not subject to natural or man-made catastrophes, even if we live a healthy life, we are inevitably going to have confrontations with death, serious injury, and threats to our own or our loved ones' physical integrity. I like to say that if we're not already suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, we suffer from a pre-traumatic one. The thread of trauma runs through life like an underground river. None of us are invulnerable, and no one is impervious to change. And our emotions operate on nerve fibers that are faster than thought, so we can't think our way out of it. Trauma impacts us even if we do not want it to. We cannot think our way around it. Like my friend after her airplane debacle, try though we may with the rational part of our brain, we cannot avoid trauma's impact. The Buddha was one of the world's first great psychologists. Long before there was a special word for trauma, he articulated the concept. He encapsulated his insights in his famous Four Noble Truths and gave the first truth, his diagnosis of the human condition, in a single word. The word is dukkha. Dukkha is usually translated as suffering, but a more accurate representation of its meaning might be something on the order of pervasive unsatisfactoriness. Life is tinged with a sense of pervasive unsatisfactoriness because of how fleeting and unpredictable and essentially uncontrollable it is. We want to have control, but despite all of our efforts, ultimately we do not. The word dukkha actually means hard to face. Dukh is difficult and ka is face. So there's a word sukha, which means sweet to face. So the Buddha wasn't denying the sweetness of life, the pleasures of life. He was just saying that, none of those pleasures will last forever. And so inevitably there's an aftermath when you're like, oh, now what, So that's the sense of pervasive unsatisfactoriness. There are aspects to life that are hard to face, taught the Buddha. We do our best not to look at them. In describing this process, the Buddha was describing our most common coping mechanisms. In an effort to protect the ego from disintegrating under the pressure of unbearable emotions, especially in the absence of Stolaro's relational home, feelings are shunted to the side. We close down to avoid them, make ourselves rigid and tense, and soldier on, devoting ourselves to work and family if we are lucky, or drowning ourselves in addiction if we are not. Psychologists call this defense against dukkha dissociation. The offending and threatening feelings are literally buried, but they're still there in the psyche, and they grab at us when we're not looking. Their symptoms may not be as explicit as the fears of exploding were to my friend, but they reverberate nonetheless. I think the thing that helped me the most in understanding this is that it's to preserve the ego, or whatever the ego is, but the sense of integrity of the self, that the unbearable emotional response to trauma has to be shunted aside, because if we were to let it impact us too directly, we become incapacitated, like my patient after the tsunami, who for a year was basically lying in a dark room, and like refusing to talk to anybody. So that's the positive aspect of dissociation or estrangement, is it's to preserve something, but it doesn't work very well is the problem. The effort to protect ourselves against trauma has the unintended effect of closing us off to ourselves and to others. The Buddha was conscious of this. Perhaps it was because he suffered an early loss himself. His mother died when he was a week old. And perhaps it was because he repeated this trauma, abandoning his wife and son several days after his son's birth. But his journey to enlightenment involved figuring out a way of confronting all of the feelings that were initially hard for him to face. The way out is through, he eventually discovered. Trauma, when acknowledged, becomes a window into an open heart and mind. This is a very difficult thing to accept. It goes against all of our conditioning. Many of us feel immediate sympathy when traumatic events impact other people. Our hearts go out to them, but there's a rush to normal in most of us. We expect people to get over it sooner rather than later. When the Swiss psychiatrist Elisabeth Kubler-Ross proposed a 5-stage model for grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, people took it to mean that we should proceed through the 5 stages sequentially and return to baseline as soon as possible. When grief lingers, we turn away. But mourning is part of life. Anyone who is alive to his or her feelings will experience it. And it has a life of its own. Only by making room for it as it actually is, not as how we imagine it should be, can we learn from it. A couple of weeks ago, I reviewed a book in the New York Times Book Review by a professor of religion at Princeton named Elaine Pagels. Some of you might have seen the book. The book's called Why Religion? And she was an expert in what became known as the Gnostic Gospels. She wrote a bestseller called The Gnostic Gospels. The Gnostic Gospels were mystical Christian texts that didn't make it into the Bible, that were instead buried in the 2nd century in a big ceramic urn somewhere in Egypt, and that were dug up in the end of the 1940s or 50s, that contained amazing texts that she was part of translating and then explaining to the West. But she, Elaine Pagels, lost her son when he was 6 years old. He was born with a hole in his heart and died about 30 years ago. And then her husband, who was a physicist and the head of the New York Academy of Sciences, not far from here, Heinz Pagels, slipped and fell while hiking down a mountain in Aspen the following summer, and he died the following summer. So this book that I reviewed, called Why Religion, is written 30 years later and is a memoir of her grief. And it took her 30 years, to put it into context and to be able to really talk about what it did to her. She quoted in that book an excerpt from the Gospel of St. Thomas, which was one of the Gnostic Gospels, which went like this: "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." So I think you can apply that in a couple of different ways, about grief, about trauma. If you don't bring forth what is within you, it will destroy you. If you do bring forth what is within you, it will save you. But I think you can also think about it as this original mind, that the Buddhists are pointing to, that is within us. That if we can, using the various techniques available, start to bring forth, then there's a lot of help there, intrinsic to each of us. So my thesis here is that there's something to learn from trauma. What in particular, what can we learn from trauma? That question has been with me for a while. When I was in my early 20s, I traveled, as I mentioned at the beginning, with some of my early Buddhist teachers, Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, and so on, to a forest monastery in rural Thailand, where Jack Kornfield had studied as a monk. Jack took me to meet his teacher, a meditation master of the forest tradition named Ajahn Chah. I had one chance to ask him a question, and the question was something like this: why dukkha? Why is that the important thing in Buddhism? Isn't it a little depressing to be emphasizing suffering all the time? Doesn't the emphasis on dukkha give Buddhism a bad name? What can we possibly learn from it? Ajahn Chah answered in the following way. "Do you see this glass?" he said, pointing to the drinking glass by his side. "For me, this glass is already broken. I enjoy it. I drink out of it. It holds the water admirably. It reflects the light in beautiful ways. If I tap it, it has a lovely ring. But when I put this glass on a shelf and the wind knocks it over, or my elbow brushes it off the table and it falls and breaks, I say, of course. Yet when I understand that this glass is already broken, every minute with it is precious." It was the last sentence that moved me the most, although it took a while for its wisdom to really dawn on me. But that last thing, when I understand that this glass is already broken, every minute with it is precious, that's the special thing about Buddhism, that it's possible to hold those two things. It's all impermanent, but we're really here with it. So to feel the preciousness of this moment, traumatic though it may be, anxious though we may be, still precious, so precious, for each of us, here together, even now in this room. Every minute with it is precious. Facing the brokenness of life allows us to appreciate its preciousness. Trauma is happening all around us. It's a fact of everyday life. It's always touching someone, and it will eventually touch us all if it hasn't already. If we can face this matter-of-factly, as parents must face the battered feelings of their children, we can wake up our own capacities for empathy and compassion. Empathy, writes Leslie Jameson in her book, The Empathy Exams, means realizing no trauma has discrete edges. Trauma bleeds out of wounds and across boundaries. Empathy, she continues, demands another kind of porousness in response. The porousness she refers to is the same as the one of the broken glass. Trauma, if it doesn't destroy us, can be a great teacher. It makes us more human, caring, and wise. Compassion, I think, is actually what grows out of it. And it is available, it's available to everyone, part and parcel of everyday life. The Tibetan yogi Milarepa once said, "The precious pot containing my riches becomes my teacher in the very moment it breaks." For me, the writings of the British child analyst D.W. Winnicott have proven to be the most inspirational on the topic, a way of bringing together a psychoanalytic and Buddhist vision. Winnicott describes the primitive agonies of childhood, in which the emotional environment between parent and child is not what it could be. The emotions of childhood, anxiety, fear, rage, loneliness, and insecurities of all kinds are potentially overwhelming. An infant is completely dependent on its caretakers to help deal with its emotional weather, and this situation continues as one grows. A parent's holding of their child's emotional experience is a critical factor in their child's development. Where there was malattunement between parent and child, there's likely to be a subsequent difficulty in that child's grown-up ability to regulate his or her own affect. The traumas of adulthood, our own and those affecting other people, those that arise in our intimate relationships and those that color our experience of old age, separation, loss, and death, are difficult, at least in part, because of how difficult their infantile counterparts were for our parents to handle. Early traumas restrict our ability to process later traumas. Michael Eigen, the analyst I quoted earlier, has written about how early emotional rapport, or lack of rapport, lives on into adult life. The environmental support our aloneness gets is necessary and remains part of our sense of aloneness all through life, he says. We may not cognize it clearly, but it lives inside us, part of an indistinguishable nexus of support that feeds a sense of existing. Anxiety is often a symptom of a deficiency in this early emotional rapport. I remember in my own psychotherapy, I had a wonderful Gestalt therapist who I used to see on the Upper West Side named Isidore Fromm. And he would always get sort of irritated with me because when sitting and talking with him, I would often stare at him, holding the contact in a way that I think for him let him see how anxious I really was, and because he would talk about healthy and unhealthy confluence, how life is really made up of moments of contact, good contact, union, where the self momentarily dissolves, and then separation, where it reconstitutes, and that flow is a kind of healthy, to be able to be in that flow is a sign of health. So he would see me staring at him, sort of anxiously maintaining my imagined rapport, and he would go, "Blink, Mark, blink." So I had to practice blinking, but I still stare at my patients like that. I think they think it's a Buddhist thing, but. Michael Eigen has called this the background feeling of primary aloneness, boundless, unknown support. and like Winnicott before him, has proposed that when there is damage to this system early in life, the personality pays a price. Wounded aloneness, akin to Michael Ballan's concept of the basic fault, is one way of describing the toll the self pays for relational failures. One of the core tenets of Buddhist thought is the self's lack of inherent existence. While this principle is often misunderstood to mean that the self does not exist at all, this is not what the Buddha's insight meant. Zen Buddhism has insisted that this particular misunderstanding of self as absence is akin to being trapped in a demon cave. The Buddhist view of self and selflessness is much more nuanced than is usually assumed. It affirms that the self does not exist in the way we usually understand it, as a concrete entity, for instance, but it does not claim that the self has no reality. Self, in the Buddhist view, is relative and relational, contingent and contextual. It can never be extracted from its environment. Indeed, the heralded experience of selflessness or emptiness, as reported by Buddhist masters over the centuries, is always accompanied by a fresh and poignant appreciation of the situational matrix in which the subject is embedded. Winnicott, in a compilation entitled Babies and Their Mothers, describes the childhood version of the relational self with characteristic poignancy. His depiction of the holding environment a good enough parent creates is a template for both Buddhist meditation and psychoanalytically inspired psychotherapy. Listen to his words describing this. What is communicated, says Winnicott, when a mother adapts to her baby's needs? I refer to the concept of holding. There's a valuable economy in the use of the term holding in the setting in which major communications take place at the beginning of a baby's experience of living. We have two things, the mother holding the baby and the baby being held and rapidly going through a series of developmental phases which are of extreme importance for the establishment of the baby as a person. The mother does not need to know what is going on inside the baby. But the baby's development cannot take place except in relation to the human reliability of the holding and the handling. The mother's capacity to meet the changing and developing needs of this one baby enables this one baby to have a line of life, relatively unbroken. The baby goes easily to and fro from integration to the ease of relaxed unintegration, and the accumulation of these experiences becomes a pattern and forms a basis for what the baby expects. The baby comes to believe in a reliability in the inward processes leading to integration into a unit. You could see my staring at Isidore as a sort of sense of insecurity in that reliability, like holding on a little too tight. As development proceeds and the baby has acquired an inside and an outside, this is Winnicott still, then the environmental reliability becomes a belief, an introject based on the experience of reliability, human and not mechanically perfect. But this kind of communication is silent. The baby does not hear or register the communication, only the effects of reliability. This is registered in terms of ongoing development. The baby does not know about the communication except from the effects of failure of reliability. This is where the difference comes in between mechanical perfection and human love. Human beings fail and fail, and in the case of ordinary care, a mother is all the time mending her failures. These relative failures with immediate remedy undoubtedly add up eventually to a communication so that the baby comes to know about success. Successful adaptation thus gives a sense of security, a feeling of having been loved. As analysts, we know about this because we are all the time failing, and we expect and get anger. If we survive, we get used. Used is a good thing in Winnicott's language. Used means your purpose is realized as a therapist or as a parent. It is the innumerable failures followed by the sort of care that mends that build up into a communication of love, of the fact that there is a human being there who cares. Where failure is not mended within the requisite time, seconds, minutes, hours, then we use the term deprivation. A deprived child is one who, after knowing about failures mended, comes to experience failure unmended. It is then the life work of the child to provoke conditions in which failures mended once more give the pattern to life. So I want to pause here for a moment. I have a couple of passages that are in a slightly different voice from the book that I wrote about trauma that I want to read next, because you can see a little bit what, maybe with different kinds of examples, what I'm trying to do with all of this. Are there any burning questions so far? We'll have much more time at the end, but anybody need to say anything? Okay, I'll just keep going. And then I think I'll read these passages, and then maybe we'll take a little break, and then I have more to deliver. So this is from this book, The Trauma of Everyday Life. Primitive agony was one of Winnicott's most important concepts. In describing how a mother helps her child get to know feelings through her holding of him, Winnicott also painted the picture of how it must feel for an infant to be deprived of such holding. While he stressed that most parents protect their children as best they can from such feelings, he also implied that anxieties are always lurking. His insights help explain a hidden and powerful aspect of the therapy the Buddha devised. Whether or not the historical Buddha actually suffered from the kind of primitive agonies Winnicott expounded upon, the meditations he taught in the aftermath of his awakening hold the mind, just as Winnicott described a mother holding an infant. Far from eliminating the ego, as I naively believed I should when I first began to practice meditation, the Buddha encouraged a strengthening of the ego so that it could learn to hold primitive agonies without collapse. A friend of mine who spent years in India with a great teacher from the ancient forest tradition tells the following story. Years after his beloved teacher had died, he was back in India, staying at the home of his guru's most devoted Indian disciple. "I must show you something," the disciple said to my friend one day. "This is what he left for me." My friend was excited, of course. Any trace of his teacher was nectar to him. He watched as the elderly man opened the creaking doors of an ancient wooden wardrobe and took something from the back of the bottom shelf. It was wrapped in an old, dirty cloth. "Do you see?" he asked my friend. "No. See what?" The disciple unwrapped the object, revealing an old, beat-up aluminum pot, the kind of ordinary pot one sees in every Indian kitchen. Looking deeply into my friend's eyes, he told him, "He left this for me when he went away, when he died. Do you see? Do you see?" "No, Dada," he replied. "I really don't see." According to my friend, Dada looked at him even more intensely, this time with a mad glint in his eyes. "You don't have to shine," he said. "You don't have to shine." He rewrapped the pot and put it back on the bottom shelf of the wardrobe. My friend had received the most important teaching, one that had its origins in the Buddha's revolutionary approach. He did not have to transform himself in the way he imagined. He just had to learn to be kind to himself. If he could hold himself with the care Dada showed while clutching the old pot, it would be enough. His ordinary self, wrapped in all of its primitive agony, was precious too. I was reminded of these connections recently by another patient, Alexa, an inspiring 35-year-old writer who told me how upset she had been with herself for uncharacteristically losing her temper with her 3-year-old son one busy weekday morning. Her story was not atypical for parents of toddlers. Her beloved child was beginning to wear her out. She was trying to get him dressed and fed and out of the house, and he was frustrating her at every turn, not wanting to put on his shoes, taking off pieces of clothing while she turned her back, asking her to play a favorite game with him, and altogether refusing to cooperate with her pleas. Having made it through his terrible 2s, she was not yet prepared for how trying his 3s could be. Exasperated, Alexa had unloaded on him. "You think the world revolves around you, and it doesn't," she cried impatiently. There was a brief pause in which he gazed at her wide-eyed. "It moves, Mama? It moves?" His earnest cry cut short her irritation, of course, and rekindled her delight in him. She still remembers the guilt she felt, though. Why would she want to say such a thing? How could she shatter his safe worldview in such an instant out of anger? His words functioned a little bit like a Zen master's response, his innocent question stopping her in her tracks. How does he even know that revolve means move, she remembers asking herself. Alexa had successfully created a world for her son of which he was the center. Her exasperated comment only affirmed how productive she'd been at fostering this illusion. Her son had what therapists call a healthy attachment to his mother. He was able to take her support entirely for granted. She had given him the attunement and responsiveness necessary to ward off most developmental trauma. She had wanted him to feel like he was the center of the world, and she had succeeded, and she was right to have done so. As today's therapists conceive of it, her first major task as a mother was mostly done. The second task, of gradually easing her child into disillusionment, of failing him just enough so that he could begin to know her as a separate person and relate to her empathically, could only be understood if and when the first mission was accomplished successfully. It was my guess that the unexpected friction between Alexa and her son heralded the beginning of a disillusioning process that would likely proceed as smoothly as the first several years had gone. Her son's unexpected reply, however, tapped into another kind of truth. The world, despite our mother's best attempts to shield us, does move incessantly, unpredictably, and without regard for our feelings. As human beings, raised, if we're lucky, to be the centers of our own little worlds, we are continually taken aback by this reality, even if we have been successfully cared for by our good enough parents. The Buddha, whose meditations resurrect the holding environment and auxiliary ego function of the good enough mother, also served as parent in this important way. He too did not shrink from disillusioning people who still harbored the impression that the world revolved around them. And then this is a little more personal, but the same idea. On my most recent retreat, I go on retreat at a place up in Massachusetts called the Forest Refuge, which is part of the Insight Meditation Society, Vipassana Retreat Center. We do silent retreats, trying to be mindful moment to moment. On my most recent retreat there at the Forest Refuge, I had an experience of the ground being pulled out from under me, and I could sense how unnerving this kind of disillusion could be. It happened at breakfast toward the end of my week there. I'd been craving toast for several days. The food had been remarkably good, but I had gotten it in my head that what was lacking was fresh-baked bread. It didn't seem like such a big thing to wish for. The vegetarian meals just needed this one little touch to feel complete. On this morning, 6 days into my stay, the bread finally appeared. Granted, it was gluten-free and made from chickpea flour, but it still looked good. I cut myself a slice, toasted and buttered it, took a little bit of apricot jam, made myself a cup of tea, and settled silently into my seat to relish it all. I was very mindful, lifted the toast to my lips to take a bite. It was delicious. I chewed and tasted and swallowed and noticed how I wanted the next bite before I had completely finished the first. When the sweetness faded and the remnants of toast turned to cardboard in my mouth, I was ready for more. I waited, though, remembering the instructions for mindful eating. Finish each mouthful completely before taking the next bite. I have only a vague recollection of what happened next. I believe my mind wandered to the laundry I had to do the next morning. There wasn't that much to think about anymore, but that didn't seem to be stopping me. Would I do one load or two? Could I put them both in at the same time? My wife would be happy if I came home with all my clothes washed. The next thing I remember was that my toast was gone. Who ate my toast? My mind cried as I stared at my empty plate. And for a brief second, before the humor of the situation could take hold, the whole thing became a metaphor for my entire life. Ready to relish it, and it was already gone. I was staring into a big, empty, devouring hole where my toast and my life used to be. Who ate my toast? I repeated once again as I swiped my finger at the few crumbs left on the plate. That was the takeaway experience of that retreat. And then this is the last little thing I'll read from this book. My friend Sharon Salzberg, who some of you may know, a Buddhist teacher herself, tells a story about her own intensive meditation experience that's very moving. Sharon was meditating under the auspices of a very accomplished but strict Burmese meditation master. She had to go to him many times a day and report what she was experiencing in her meditations, giving him a virtual moment-to-moment rendition of what was unfolding in her mind. These meetings had an air of formality about them. They did not last long, although they were frequent, and the master could be gruff, reserved, and intimidating. On this retreat, she was crying quite a bit while she was meditating, but she was uncomfortable telling him the extent of her sadness and somewhat ashamed of the intensity of her feelings. They did not seem to fit with her expectations of herself or with what the practice was supposed to be doing. Sharon's experience on her retreat presented her with a dilemma, one that was highlighted by the silence of the environment and her wish to have her teacher's approval. The self she was attached to, the person she thought she should be, and the image she had of herself did not encompass losing control of her emotions in this way. She resisted her feelings and downplayed them in her interviews. When asked repeatedly what was happening in her meditations, she finally indicated that there was a little crying going on. "Are you crying a lot?" the Burmese master questioned her. "Not so much," she said, putting a brave face on. "When you cry in meditation," he responded, suddenly addressing her very personally, "you should cry with your whole heart." When the Burmese master encouraged Sharon to cry with her whole heart, he was inviting her into her sadness, suggesting that she explore it with the curiosity that mindfulness fosters. In trying to keep it at bay, she was unknowingly giving it a power over her. Her teacher was trying to help her heal a split she had created, her ego on the one side and her sorrow on the other. He understood that in crying with her whole heart, Sharon could recover not just her emotional pain, but her emotional presence. This was his secret agenda, to undermine the ego's need to protect itself from painful affect and thereby restore its emotional foundation. Mindfulness dropped Sharon into the space between her ego and her unwanted emotion. It positioned her within the split she had made for herself and allowed her to look around. Her teacher gave her the chance to be at one with herself. It wasn't just self-observation, and it wasn't only surrendering into the feeling. In asking her to bring those qualities together, to cry with her whole heart, the Burmese teacher was also showing her something she did not know about her mind. It could use her pain for its own development. So I was given a fresh insight into the relationship of Buddhist thought and psychodynamic thought some years ago when I was teaching a workshop with Professor Robert Thurman, who's a professor of Buddhist studies at Columbia University, and Uma Thurman's father is how he's usually known. It was from Professor Thurman that I learned that the root of the Sanskrit word for the liberating vision of emptiness, the Sanskrit word is shunyata, derives from a word meaning to swell. The metaphorical meaning of the word implies the swelling of a seed or of a pregnant womb. And this idea of emptiness, like holding for Winnicott, is the key concept in Buddhist psychology of relevance for trauma, but it's almost always misunderstood. Buddha's emptiness was a full emptiness, one rich with potential, one big enough to hold the entire world of possibility, not an absolute nothingness, the way I might have imagined it. One day when we were teaching together about all of this, Thurman reached impulsively for a volume of his called Essential Tibetan Buddhism. On this particular day, he'd been listening to me talk about Winnicott, about the good enough mother and the way meditation and therapy mimics the holding environment of the early parent-infant couple. He realized he had translated a poem about it, one that I had never bothered to look at, buried as it was on page 209 of his text, deep in a chapter entitled Practicing the Liberating Wisdom. I prided myself on having read most of Thurman's body of work, but the poem took me completely by surprise. But there it was, the discovery of Mother Voidness, a song of enlightenment, by the great Mongolian Lama Jangkya Rolwe Dorje, who lived between 1717 and 1786, written at the sacred mountain Wu Tai Shan in Shensei province of China in the aftermath of his awakening. Rolwe Dorje's verse was in a long line of enlightenment songs whose function is to express in Thurman's words joy and appreciation in the euphoria and lucidity of just having attained a comprehensive freedom from ageless suffering and anxiety. It began like this. May the Guru, who nakedly reveals this as it is, his kindness irrepayable, be enthroned in my heart. I will speak spontaneously whatever comes to mind. I was struck by this last line. I will speak spontaneously whatever comes to mind. It startled me a little, evoking as it did the psychoanalytic tradition of Freud, whose technique of free association rested on just this activity. They already knew about free association in the 1700s in Mongolia, I thought. I waited for what might come next. What would a newly enlightened Lama spontaneously declare? I was like a mad child, long lost his old mother. Never could find her, though she was with him always. But now it seems I'm about to find that kind old mother, since big brother relativity hints where she hides. It was difficult for me to listen too carefully once Professor Thurman had belted out the first several lines of this verse. Something was choking up inside. Like a mad child long lost his old mother, never could find her though she was with him always. My mind kept repeating the phrase. I hadn't lost my own kind mother, but that didn't stop me from relating to the notion of a mad child. Winnicott once wrote that there are two categories of people in the world, those who carry around having been mad and those who do not. By mad, he meant crazy, not angry, but there was a deliberate ambiguity in his words, a strong link between the two in his thinking. Having been mad, he proposed, meant there was once a breakdown at the dawn of an individual's life, a breakdown in the dynamic parent-infant environment that supports and facilitates development. Here was a Buddhist monk alluding to these same phenomenon. Thurman was evoking all of this for me while reading the Mongolian verse. I think yes, yes, and then no, no, then could it be really? These various subjects and objects are my mother's smiling face. These births, deaths, and changes are my mother's lying words. My undeceiving mother has deceived me. My only hope of refuge is in big brother relativity. The poem, as Thurman explained, is about trauma. It takes the smiling face of the mother as the prototype of the awakened mind. A mother feels her infant to be the best of her and regards him thus. The mother is the most highly evolved of our mammalian species. Through learning to nurture and develop life within her own body, she has achieved a capacity for empathy and compassion that the rest of us are still searching for. This verse describes the perplexity of the monk as his understanding dawns. He's been searching for something outside of himself, imagining enlightenment as some kind of external achievement, as a place to be journeyed to, or a state to be achieved, something apart from the trauma of everyday life. This brings to mind Winnicott's distinction between mechanical perfection and human love. Before his awakening, the monk conceived of enlightenment as some kind of perfection. After awakening, he can only frame it as human love, the kind in which there are failures and failures and failures mended. As he awakens, he starts to get glimmers of enlightenment in the everyday. He wonders if it could really be so and begins to see that his habits of mind, his inhibitions of ego function, have kept him removed. The long-lost mother is shunyata, voidness, freedom or emptiness, the swelling pregnant womb, the understanding that nothing exists independently in its own right, apart from the world in which it is embedded. The Lama had felt himself to be absolutely alone, searching for release, a victim in our language of developmental or relational trauma. But his awakening came when he dropped that point of view. A shift took place, and Shunyata, mother to all, revealed herself, hiding in plain sight, part and parcel of the various subjects and objects mistakenly perceived as threatening and existing independently. She was there in all things, none of them isolated entities as they were often imagined to be, but all of them relative, relational in nature, part of an interdependent whole that included the meditating Lama and his subjective awareness. His awakened mind finally understood oneness to be simultaneous with everything being different. The mother he was searching for was not outside of him, he finally reasoned. She was him. His face, her face, and the world's face were the same surface. The undeceiving mother, present everywhere, had deceived him. I loved this image. It made something in me relax. Michael Eigen, who I quoted before on Boundless Unknown Support, has his own contemporary version of the Lama's poem. Winnicott writes of essential aloneness, Eigen says. Now that's a strong term, essential aloneness. He feels that we are essentially alone. He says the baby is supported in an alone state by a not quite cognized presence. That is, we are supported. When we are supported well, we are supported in an alone state without quite realizing we are getting support. That's why if therapy goes well, patients may feel they've done it all by themselves and the therapist did very little. The patient didn't know it was the therapist who helped. Well, that's a very good kind of help. Hayo Kawai, in a book called Buddhism and the Art of Psychotherapy, describes an analogous process. Kawai was a Jungian analyst in Japan. He studied in Zurich in 1965, who came to Buddhism and to understand the relevance of Buddhism for therapy only after he had studied Jungian psychoanalysis. The key point of the philosophy of sudden enlightenment, he writes, is the possibility that enlightenment exists from the beginning, although the process involved in reaching it may be gradual. When I began psychotherapy, he says, I was captured by the thought that I would encounter a suffering client who instantly would be released from the problematical situation after having a wonderful experience of insight. And it would have been the interpretation that I offered which was most helpful in achieving such a change. But actually, of course, I am incapable of giving anything. The client walks his or her own path of individuation. So-called insight may help, but the client rarely reaches full resolution through it. Even though one has insight, the process advances gradually. The process could even reverse, even after having insight. Going back and forth, I believe the therapist has to maintain a strong trust in the circle which encloses the whole, and just continue being there. Agony, like the Mongolian Lama and the Zen analyst, affirmed that our essential aloneness is supported by an unknown, boundless presence, by the smiling face of the mother. For many people, aloneness can be wounded and seem oppressive, as it would to a mad child long lost his old mother, to a victim of trauma. But there's another experience waiting in the wings, one that can be divined with proper support and guidance, one that is part of our birthright. Never could find her, though she was with him always, sang the newly enlightened Lama. Agony has said something similar. To be permeable and distinct, connected and separate, in union yet alone, is part of our plasticity and persistence, part of the mystery, difficulty, and creative challenge of our nature. Can we make room for ourselves? All of this speaks to the issue of trauma. As Stolorow points out, estrangement, alienation, and dissociation are inevitable consequences of trauma. One's emotional horizons are narrowed and deadened, a defensive self-ideal, purified of offending affect states deemed offensive to self or others, is established, and one feels irrevocably separate from the rest of humanity. The need, he affirms, is for attunement and responsiveness, for a relational home in which emotional experience, no matter how crushing, can be held. Phil Clay, the author of an award-winning short story collection called Redeployment, about his time as a soldier in Iraq, puts it this way. Telling of an encounter with a female friend, herself a victim of childhood sexual abuse, he hears her say, after resonating with his description of the shocking numbness he felt looking at the victims of a suicide bombing, "I'm sorry, I don't mean to compare my experience to yours. I could never imagine what you've been through." Why separate veterans from the rest of mankind, he asks. If we fetishize trauma as incommunicable, then survivors are trapped, unable to feel truly known by their non-military friends and family. He quotes the actor Adam Driver, speaking of the alienation he felt after leaving the Marine Corps and the healing he found in his work in the theater. Not being able to express the anger, confusion, and loneliness I felt was challenging, Driver said, until theater exposed him to playwrights and characters and plays that had nothing to do with the military, that were articulating experiences I had in the military that before, to me, were indescribable. Clay continues, you don't honor someone by telling them, I can never imagine what you've been through. Instead, listen to their story. Try to imagine being in it, no matter how hard or uncomfortable that feels. If the past years have taught us anything, it's that in the age of the all-volunteer military, it's far too easy for Americans to send soldiers on deployment after deployment without making a serious effort to imagine what that means. We can do better. This idea of a relational home for trauma is also supported by recent research, even in animal models. At Emory University, the neurobiologist who developed the rat model for the trauma of maternal separation, has recently changed his views. In his original research, he separated mothers and pups for first 15 and then 180 minutes. 15 minutes were tolerated well. 180 minutes were the equivalent of never coming back. After 15 minutes, the mothers would sniff and lick, gather and feed, and whisper gentle warbles. After 180 minutes, the mothers would dash around emitting panicky squeaks. This 180 model became the template for developmental trauma. This changed when the researcher had an epiphany. Maybe the mother views her environment as unsafe, since she's put back in the same cage. He remade the environment, creating a larger room with choices for her, and saw something remarkable. No matter how long or how often they were separated, the mother, with choice, would pick a new corner, coddle and nurse her pups, and things would be okay. The varied, secure environment allowed her to feel calmer and more in control. His conclusion: trauma seemed to rise not just from the separation alone, but from the flavor of the reunion. It's this idea of the flavor of the reunion, the relational home, that links Buddhism, psychotherapy, and the treatment and study of trauma and anxiety. I'll read you one last thing that has moved me. It's a little disturbing, so I apologize for that, but I think it's worth getting to the point of it. It's something that appeared in the New York Times 6 years ago. It's called "I Was Wounded, My Honor Wasn't." 32 years ago, when I was 17 and living in Bombay, I was gang raped and nearly killed. 3 years later, outraged at the silence and misconceptions around rape, I wrote a fiery essay under my own name describing my experience for an Indian women's magazine. It created a stir in the women's movement and in my family, and then it quietly disappeared. Then last week, I looked at my email, and there it was. As part of the outpouring of public rage after a young woman's rape and death in Delhi, somebody posted the article online, and it went viral. Since then, I've received a deluge of messages from people expressing their support. It's not exactly pleasant to be a symbol of rape. I'm not an expert, nor do I represent all victims of rape. All I can offer is that unlike the young woman who died in December 2 weeks after being brutally gang raped, and so many others, my story didn't end, and I can continue to tell it. When I fought to live that night, I hardly knew what I was fighting for. A male friend and I had gone for a walk up a mountain near my home. 4 armed men caught us and made us climb to a secluded spot where they raped me for several hours and beat both of us. They argued amongst themselves about whether or not to kill us and finally let us go. At 17, I was just a child. Life rewarded me richly for surviving. I stumbled home wounded and traumatized to a fabulous family. With them on my side, so much came my way. I found true love, I wrote books, I saw a kangaroo in the wild, I caught buses and missed trains, I had a shining child, the century changed, my first gray hair appeared. Too many others will never experience that. They will not see that it gets better, that the day comes when one incident is no longer the central focus of your life. One day you find you are no longer looking behind you, expecting every group of men to attack. One day you wind a scarf around your throat without having a flashback to being choked. One day you are not frightened anymore. Rape is horrible, but it is not horrible for all the reasons that have been drilled into the heads of Indian women. It's horrible because you are violated, you are scared someone else takes control of your body and hurts you in the most intimate way. It's not horrible because you lose your virtue. It's not horrible because your father and your brother are dishonored. If we take honor out of the equation, rape will still be horrible, but it will be a personal and not a societal horror. We will be able to give women who have been assaulted what they truly need, not a load of rubbish about how they should feel guilty or ashamed, but empathy for going through a terrible trauma. The week after I was attacked, I heard the story of a woman who was raped in a nearby suburb. She came home, went into the kitchen, set herself on fire, and died. The person who told me the story was full of admiration for her selflessness in preserving her husband's honor. Thanks to my parents, I never did understand this. At 17, I thought the scariest thing that could happen in my life was being hurt and humiliated in such a painful way. At 49, I know I was wrong. The scariest thing is imagining my 12-year-old child being hurt and humiliated. Not because of my family's honor, but because she trusts the world, and it is infinitely painful to think of her losing that trust. When I look back, it is not the 17-year-old me I want to comfort, but my parents. They had the job of picking up the pieces. This is where our work lies with those of us who are raising the next generation. It lies in teaching our sons and daughters to become liberated, respectful adults who know that men who hurt women are making a choice and will be punished. When I was 17, I could not have imagined thousands of people marching against rape in India, as we've seen in these past weeks. And yet there is still work to be done. We've spent generations constructing elaborate systems of patriarchy, caste, and social and sexual inequality that allow abuse to flourish. But rape is not inevitable like the weather. We need to shelve all the gibberish about honor and virtue and did she lead him on and could he help himself. We need to put responsibility where it lies, on men who violate women and on all of us who let them get away with it, while we point accusing fingers at their victims. So that sense of the flavor of the reunion and the, changing the relational home in which the trauma is held is, I think, starkly expressed there. Over the years, when I've gone on these retreats, I always sneak a little notebook in to the retreat with me, even though you're not supposed to read or write or anything in the retreats. But I always have the hope that maybe I'll have, like a really profound thought, or I'll hear a great teaching and maybe I should save whatever it is to use in my writings. So I always bring the same little notebook. And every 10 years or so, I go through it. And what I keep discovering is that I'm always writing down different variations of the same thing. Because every time I hear it, it's like I'm hearing it for the first time, and it seems so profound. So the thing I keep writing down is it's not what you are experiencing that matters, it's how you relate to it. And that's a basic instruction in mindfulness. And when we do our little meditation exercise, I think that's what I'm going to be trying to impart. It's not what you're experiencing that matters, it's how you relate to it. And that really applies to all this talk about trauma and anxiety and to this moment in time. We're all experiencing all kinds of very, very difficult things. But it's not what we're experiencing that ultimately matters. It's how we all relate to it. This is what moved me in the first place about Buddhism, that there was something practical I could put my mind to. We can't make trauma go away, but we can change our response to it, turn down its valence, change the relational home in which it is experienced, spice up the flavor of the reunion. As Winnicott liked to say, in a phrase that might equally apply to the returning veteran as well as the Mongolian Lama, it is a joy to be hidden, but disaster not to be found. And then I have one more kind of closing thing that's beautiful, to me anyway. This is part of a poem by a woman named Louise Gluck. Many of you who would be familiar with her poetry. It's from a collection called Faithful and Virtuous Night that came out a couple of years ago. And the poem is called The Sword and the Stone, which is a good title. King Arthur and all. But I think it also relates to this idea of something primary, the primary original face of the mother or enlightenment or that lurks within, that encased in the stone, that if we're lucky, we get to pull out. So Louise Gluck apparently suffered from anorexia when she was young, and then ended up in psychoanalysis for 7 years before she found herself as a poet. So some of her poems allude to that history, and this one is about her psychoanalysis, or about one moment within her psychoanalysis that I think speaks to some of what I've been trying to talk about in a different way. So it starts like this. My analyst looked up briefly. Naturally, I couldn't see him, but I had learned in our years together to intuit these movements. As usual, he refused to acknowledge whether or not I was right. My ingenuity versus his evasiveness, our little game. At such moments, I felt the analysis was flourishing. It seemed to bring out in me a sly vivaciousness I was inclined to repress. My analyst's indifference to my performances was now immensely soothing. An intimacy had grown up between us, like a forest around a castle. The blinds were closed. Vacillating bars of light advanced across the carpeting. Through a small strip above the windowsill, I saw the outside world. All this time, I had the giddy sensation of floating above my life. Far away, that life occurred. But was it still occurring? That was the question. Late summer, the light was fading. Escaped shreds flickered over the potted plants. The analysis was in its 7th year. I had begun to draw again, modest little sketches, occasional three-dimensional constructs, modeled on functional objects. And yet, the analysis required much of my time. From what was this time deducted? That was also the question. I lay watching the window, long intervals of silence alternating with somewhat listless ruminations and rhetorical questions. My analyst, I felt, was watching me. So in my imagination, a mother stares at her sleeping child, forgiveness preceding understanding. Or more likely, so my brother must have gazed at me. Perhaps the silence between us prefigured this silence, in which everything that remained unspoken was somehow shared. It seemed a mystery. Then the hour was over. I descended as I had ascended. The doorman opened the door. The mild weather of the day had held. Above the shop, striped awnings had unfurled, protecting the fruit. Restaurants, shops, kiosks with late newspapers and cigarettes. The insides grew brighter as the outside grew darker. Perhaps the drugs were working. At some point, the streetlights came on. I felt suddenly a sense of cameras beginning to turn. I was aware of movement around me, my fellow beings driven by a mindless fetish for action. How deeply I resisted this. It seemed to me shallow and false, or perhaps partial and false, whereas truth as I saw it, was expressed as stillness. I walked a while, staring into the windows of the galleries. My friends had become famous. I could hear the river in the background, from which came the smell of oblivion, interlaced with potted herbs from the restaurants. I had arranged to join an old acquaintance for dinner. There he was at our accustomed table. The wine was poured. He was engaged with the waiter, discussing the lamb. As usual, a small argument erupted over dinner, ostensibly concerning aesthetics. It was allowed to pass. Outside, the bridge glittered. Cars rushed back and forth. The river glittered back, imitating the bridge. Nature reflecting art, something to that effect. My friend found the image potent. He was a writer. His many novels at the time were much praised. One was much like another, and yet his complacency disguised suffering as perhaps my suffering disguised complacency. We had known each other many years. Once again, I had accused him of laziness. Once again, he flung the word back. He raised his glass and turned it upside down. "This is your purity," he said. "This is your perfectionism." The glass was empty. It left no mark on the tablecloth. The wine had gone to my head. I walked home slowly, brooding, a little drunk. The wine had gone to my head, or was it the night itself, the sweetness at the end of summer? "It is the critics," he said. "The critics have the ideas. We artists," he included me, "we artists are just children at our games." Therapist, too, I think. Okay. That's the end of my formal presentation. No, you can wait.